We're looking forward to continuing to offer ongoing thought leadership and insights across marketing categories digitally over the next few months. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping reminders. We have muted all of your microphones for the presentation. To ask questions, please enter them in the Zoom Q&A feature or on our Slido, event number 95370. Q&A will take place after the presentation. We will be recording this webinar for access after the event. This will not include the Q&A. The recording, along with the schedule of upcoming events, can be found on our website. Our website is experiencediamond.com ahead of the curve. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce you to our host, Nicole Gluckman, our Vice President of Account Management, to introduce today's topic and our speakers.
Thanks, Kala, and hello, everybody, and welcome to Ahead of the Curve number 4. Before we get started, quick plug for next week. It's going to be a really great discussion. Our head of influencer, Brooke DeCatch, will be presenting Engaging from a Distance, how the influencer industry has evolved amid COVID-19, which deeper dives into how influencer marketing is undergoing a seismic shift with major ramifications to both consumers and brands. It's going to be one to watch for sure. Back to today, I'm really excited. This is a topic that is so relevant due to the ever-changing landscape of COVID-19. The use of media and earning trust is crucial to maintain your brand significance and, quite frankly, credibility at this time. And we have a fantastic speaker for you today, Wendy Bairos, Diamond Group's head of PR, who is joined by a special guest and panelist, Sean Stanleigh, head of Globe content at the Globe and Mail. So welcome to them both, and I'm going to move into bios. First up is Wendy, a communications specialist and team leader with over 17 years of experience. Wendy Bairos spent over a decade working at Google, where she was known for her creativity, consensus building skills, and ability to keep pace with rapidly changing models of content. Her skills include developing strategic communication programs from conception to implementation. Wendy sat on the Luminato Advisory Committee and is the Now Magazine Advisory Committee. And Steve Stanley. Sean Stanleigh. I'm so sorry. I knew I was going to screw that up today, and I did in front of everybody. And so I will not do that again. And if I do, I will put money in a Sean Stanleigh jar, and I will send it to you an apology. So Sean Stanleigh is head of Globe Content Studio, the content marketing arm of the Globe and Mail. His team blends audience data with journalistic intuition and experience to craft great storytelling on behalf of brands, positioning them as thought leaders with influential audiences across multiple platforms. He is also co-chair of Lab 351, the company's internal business incubator, which is training employees to think like entrepreneurs. Sean has held a number of senior editing roles at the Globe and Toronto Star in disciplines that include small business, national, foreign and local news, and entertainment. He regularly appears at events, formerly live and now virtually, as a host, speaker, and moderator. So welcome, Wendy and Sean. And thank you again, everyone, for joining today. And over to you, Wendy, to get started.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I guess first things first, as it has been with all of these webinars, our disclaimer. We are not medical experts or virologists. We have been collecting a lot of information, and the information is vast. And science is our friend. Everything that we're sharing has been sourced through reputable channels, and I will be making some speculations. That is what we are not. What we are is an agency that strives to truly understand human behavior, peeling away at the onion of human insights, and articulating comprehensive customer-first marketing and communication strategies, and connecting brands to the values of their customers. So let's get started. While we've been practicing physical distancing for a couple of months now, and there are a lot of people working from home, there's not only been a surge in internet traffic, but more importantly, there's been an increase in consumption of news and information, not only on digital platforms, but traditional media has also seen a spike over the last few months. Numeris released stats indicating that English viewing television has been up 36% between the hours of 9 and noon, and up 33% between the hours of noon and 4. And then Comscore has reported that Canadians have flocked to news and information websites in record numbers, driven by politics, general news, local news, and of course the weather. The category remains a huge area of focus, and visitation and engagement are at near record high levels. Oh, whoops. Hang on a second. There we go. I realize, there we are. Sorry about that. Canadians have been engrossed in the latest news, seeking out daily information related to the coronavirus. They want to know what the latest update on the pandemic is. And the audiences, they want fact-based and compassionate messaging and communication. The volume of news and content being published, as well as the consumption of news media, has spiked. So this is where the eyeballs are. And it is, of course, second nature for brands to be where everybody is, to be a part of this conversation and something that is affecting the entire world. But when Canadians are in their information-based search, and when they're looking for daily updates about COVID-19, they don't want to be sold to. PR provides this opportunity to engage at these moments and authentically build brand awareness. But more importantly, it's an opportunity to earn trust that can be then leveraged for brand equity across your marketing mix later. As consumers have shifted their focus from toward information from commercialism, so too must brands. This is a big opportunity. But of course, there could also be big risk in not doing anything, or more importantly, not doing it well. As PR professionals, we're often preparing for crisis, usually in hopes that it never happens. But here we are. And as Winston Churchill famously said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So let's consider how reporters in this 24-hour, 7 days a week news cycle are churning out more content than ever before. And they're churning out content related to one topic, COVID-19. But while they continue to turn to experts, the opportunity is that more than ever, they're turning to companies, they're turning to brands, they're turning to executives. This is a great opportunity as they're digging into the impact of the pandemic is having on people, industries, businesses, and cities. This is how successful companies are building brand equity now, by earning trust. They are engaging with media through relevant and timely stories, shifting from being straight promotional. So lowestrates.ca, for example, their financial rate comparison site, they have had their finger on the pulse and understood that along with the uncertainty of health and the coronavirus, a lot of people were facing financial uncertainty as well. And their CEO, Justin Tuin, has been regularly connecting with media, their message focused on how to help Canadians save money. So for example, as Canadians are not driving to work anymore, or nowhere for that matter, there are less cars on the road. So there's opportunities to bring your car insurance payments down. They talked about how refinancing your mortgage could save on interest payments. Their message was direct, it was relevant, and it was helpful. But more important than that, lowest rates began appearing in news outlets they had never been before, bringing them in front of a net new and engaged audience. But not all brands have a message that is a straight line response to a specific uncertainty. There is still opportunity to earn trust. And this is not about capitalizing on the crisis, but rather as Canadians are seeking information from their trusted sources, it's an opportunity to be a part of their story. And there are 3 themes that I've seen really stand out that are helping companies build that trust. And that's prioritizing people, not profit, providing real value to their customers and by extension, Canadians, and of course, doubling down on social responsibility. So I'm going to go through these 3 categories with some examples, and then we'll open up the discussion and bring Sean in kind of for the perspective from the news category. So when I was saying prioritizing people over profits, what I mean is those companies that have illustrated that they're putting their employees and their well-being first. They're being recognized for it. A recent study from Kantar revealed that 75% of people, they want to know how brands are reacting to the current pandemic. And another 78% are urging brands to take care of their employees during this time. Consumers are watching what companies are doing, And articles and reports have gone on to say that companies that act humanely right now, they will be remembered for years to come. Of course, the same applies if you completely miss the mark. In fact, the Edelman 2020 Trust Barometer showed that 52% of respondents said brands must do this in order to not only earn, but to keep their trust. So I want to look at Shopify, for example. They were one of the first companies to enforce the work from home policy early on when the outbreak of COVID-19 began. And in a gesture of support, to help their employees, they offered them $1,000 to buy supplies and begin to ease that transition from working in the office to working from home. The story not only crossed business media, but more importantly, we started to see Shopify added to the list of brands that were responding the best to COVID-19. And of course, the emotional landscape at that time had shifted and people became really worried about their income. So taking note of that, Starbucks on March 20th, they announced that they would be paying their employees for the next 30 days, whether they were for the next 30 days, regardless if they showed up to work during the coronavirus pandemic. And those that did show up, they'd receive an additional $3 an hour pay rise while they were working over that to really garner some positive coverage to combat that. So what stands out to me in both of these examples is that Shopify and Starbucks were put forward solution-based stories. So as we move through recovery post-COVID, brands should continue to communicate with solution-based messaging. The opportunities continue as we reevaluate our internal and external communication strategy plans and ensure an alignment with this new environment that we're in. For instance, think about how are you going to be supporting your employees as they come back into the office when cities open up? Can you create content that celebrates your teams? Can you do the same for customers or vendors that you work with? It is important to be thinking about your business as usual communication now, but to do so in a framework of this new reality. In the post-crisis environment, the headlines should continue to be people first, not company first. And in addition to the focus on people, brings me to my second theme. My second theme that stood out, that people want to look at stories that are adding value, and they want to know how your brand is providing that value. So consider your role in your customers' daily lives and how you can matter to their recovery. So small business, for example, retail, restaurants, etc., they've had to close their doors. They're pivoting to e-commerce to continue to serve their customer base. And I'm going to use another Shopify example here, but last month they announced a new cash loan advances for small businesses across Canada. And these loans ranged anywhere from $200 to $500,000 per eligible merchant, providing this fast relief to cash-strapped businesses. What Shopify was doing with this program is really acknowledging how daunting it can be for their core customer base to take on debt. This is an example of how a brand was helping to solve, not sell, understanding that that will come later. The story garnered wide coverage across broadcast, digital, Canada, US, but more importantly, it gave Shopify an edge over Amazon at an important time when small businesses are starting to move online for the first time. So organizations perceived as empathetic, they not only gain trust, but more importantly, they gain loyal customers. In that Edelman Trust survey that I mentioned earlier, they also cited that 84% of respondents expect companies to focus their advertising and communications on how products and services can help people cope. They want to know how your products are helping in the pandemic and pandemic-related life challenges. And the vast majority expect brands to show that they are aware not only of the crisis, but of its impact. So think back to the news in early March when the pandemic began taking over. The headlines were about the elderly and how those with compromised immune systems were in most danger. They're being urged to stay home regardless of how they were feeling for their own safety. At the same time, we were reading stories about the shortage in toilet paper and, of course, grocery store shelves being empty. These two themes sparked worry, and Canadians became vocal on social channels and their concern on how the seniors were going to get their supplies safely. Shortly thereafter, we saw Loblaws come out with an announcement implementing specially dedicated shopping hours. The first hour of shopping in all their stores would be dedicated to seniors and those with a disability. Of course, nearly all grocers across the country followed suit, but the difference here is that being first to market, Loblaws was showing that they were responding and taking action based on community need. It wasn't just about hours of operation. Loblaws not only gained tremendous coverage about their program, but it was described as a direct response and an example of brands doing the right thing and taking action. It's that listening, that relevant response that builds trust with Canadians. Being relevant with messages and bringing real value to the table is as important now as it was at the early stages of this communication during the COVID-19 pandemic. The ratio of pandemic to non-pandemic news, that's gradually going to shift. And readership and social sharing of coronavirus stories, they're going to decline. But communication from earned trust now will translate to earned marketing when it reflects consumers' priorities. And as we move beyond triage to look forward mode, it's also worth mentioning that it shouldn't all be doom and gloom. In measuring sentiment and consumption trends regularly and closely observing the conversations around social media platforms, you find these unique opportunities for brands to engage with media, to tell their new stories in the crisis. And when they're positive, they are going to shine through. Customers right now, they need to know that you're seeing the world through their viewpoint and communicating to them in ways that are truly helpful and not based on predetermined schedules. Google searches for good news spiked in the second week of April, and they reached a 5-year high at this time, according to Google Analytics. And Google Trends analysis in recent days show that people are starting to search for ways to combat boredom, whether it's finding new books or or finding activities for kids. The opportunity for brands here is that the media and the news outlets, they're picking up on this audience sentiment and this need for more and different and positive, optimistic stories. And they're beginning to reframe their reporting and looking at highlighting these optimistic stories again. So speaking of positive and optimistic stories, the third and final theme that really stood out to earning trust is how brands are taking action around social responsibility. The industry has been talking about social responsibility being good for business for years. This is not new. A brand's social responsibility has already been having an important role in customers' purchase decisions and loyalty and their loyalty. And the pandemic is only highlighting that. According to a Twitter survey, 77% feel more positively about brands making an effort to support society during the crisis. Humans may have a short memory, but consumers have a long memory, and your role in supporting social initiatives now will be remembered as the economy opens up. Take AB InBev, for example. We've seen stories showcasing their social responsibility through crisis across markets worldwide. We've learned about how they've reallocated sports sponsorship to support the American Red Cross, how Stella Artois launched Rally for Restaurants gift card program to help local restaurants and bars hit hard by COVID-19. And then Labatt Breweries of Canada, for example, mobilizing its breweries to produce and deliver 6 truckloads of canned drinking water to COVID-19 relief efforts in Toronto. By launching a number of different programs, what they were able to do across both national and local markets is have this continuous drumbeat of coverage and keep their brand in the forefront and in front of customers with a very positive and supportive message. Audiences have been very clear about what they want to hear from brands. And at the beginning of the pandemic had been indicating that they want brands to focus on producing goods that help people meet their pandemic-related challenges. As reports came out about the shortage of hand sanitizer across the country, for example, we saw small local distilleries pivot and begin to develop hand sanitizer for frontline workers and other groups in need. Since then, we saw large luxury brands and other big distillers and many companies follow suit. But this was interesting because small businesses don't often have an advantage over big brands. And in this case, because of their creativity and their agility, this allowed these smokable batch distillers to be the first to market to solve a problem in their community and to build positive brand awareness with new audiences, garnering national coverage that they might not have otherwise seen. Looking at it through a lens of post-crisis environment, in many cases, your strategy is still viable. It just may require some adjustments. At this moment of deepest need, the new world for brands will have trust at its core. Brands should now be focused more than ever on bringing their corporate character forward. And your social responsibility efforts, they don't need to be specific to the pandemic. Recent polling from Ipsos, conducted across 14 countries, shows that 71% believe that the long-term climate change is as serious a crisis as COVID-19. So there are many different directions and organizations and opportunities to contribute greatly to the success of society. And while trust has always been important to customers, in a time of crisis, the desire to patronize brands that are trusted increased. 60% of consumers reported they find themselves turning towards brands that they are absolutely sure they can trust. On the flip side, 71% of global consumers agree that if they perceive a brand is putting profit over people, they will lose trust in that brand forever, according to the 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer. It is crisis is the new normal. That doesn't mean that we will always be dealing with crisis. But what it does mean is that even as we flatten the curve and that cities begin to open up, we should expect and be ready for things to change monthly or even weekly and be able to pivot accordingly with the abnormal uncertainty that we're faced with. So through PR and working with the media, brands have this opportunity to participate in timely conversations, to be relevant and continue to build and earn trust. Yes, the market is saturated, but crisis also provides this unique time for brands and even new brands to stand out in a crowded marketplace as a result of innovative and compassionate ways of responding to the virus outbreak. Like think about those small batch examples that I was talking about, or small batch distilleries I was talking about earlier. In fact, 37% of consumers indicated that they had recently started using a new brand as a direct result of their crisis-related communication efforts. All of this to say that looking forward, consider whether your communication strategy is still relevant and whether it serves your brand's goals. In many cases, your strategy is still viable, but it may require adjustment. So think about reevaluating it regularly to adopt the ever-changing reality. Adjust your communication strategy based on real-time trends, and of course, communicate on your audience's terms. When your strategy is centered around people, providing value, and focused on social responsibility, your brand will continue to earn and build trust that can be leveraged across marketing channels later. With COVID-19 continuing to be top of mind across media channels, PR and news outlets provide a real opportunity for brands to communicate directly and to tune in to what matters to their audiences, their health, the well-being of their friends and family, and their community. The pandemic has reminded us of the vital role of journalists and the news outlets and the role that they play in our community. Understanding the news is the first step in shaping it. And through the stories that we share, we'll start to earn a level of trust that's going to build brand equity to open up new consumer opportunities in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy. That was great. There was a lot of really great insights in there. And it just reaffirmed for me how important PR and the media is, especially in times like these where that is where people are going to get their information. And so thanks for sharing. We're going to move into our panelist conversation with Sean Stanleigh. And we have some pre-developed questions that we're going to run through first, and then we'll pivot to audience questions if there are any. For those of you that are attending over the Zoom, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you on YouTube, please refer to the Slido that was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So Wendy and Sean, thank you again, and thank you for running us through that. I'm going to move forward with a question for Sean. Sean, Wendy has claimed that since the start of the pandemic, consumption of news media has picked up substantially. What have you seen at the Globe and Mail?
Wendy's claim is accurate. Newsrooms are best when big stories happen. Whether it's 9/11, the first SARS, the war in Afghanistan, election night, federal, provincial, local, this is when newsrooms turn on the jets and are at their best. And so what we see as a result of that is an increase in traffic that goes along with the size of the story. Well, COVID-19, probably the biggest story in my lifetime, at least, and probably anybody working in the Globe and Mail newsroom. As a result of that story, our traffic has tripled to our website. So we thought we might see some print subscriptions go down. We did not. We've seen them either hold steady or increase, particularly on weekends. Our digital subscriptions have been going up week over week. Our registrations, which is usually the sort of first step towards subscriptions, have been going up week over week. And the page views and unique visitors to our site have been exponential in those increases. So it's been a pretty amazing thing to watch because, of course, we have access to so much in the way of analytics these days. Every day, just to go in and take a look at stories that were trending, to take a look at the stories that really took off from a subscription standpoint or took off from a page view standpoint has been really interesting. I think there is no way to predict these things happening most of the time, unless, for example, it's something like an election. And when they do happen, it reminds you that, despite all the cries of fake news that we've been hearing over the past several years, when big news happens, it is still big media that people turn to for information. And as someone who works in that industry, we're obviously grateful for that. I do think that it brings out the best in journalists. And I like to think that the reason we're seeing those traffic increases is because we're providing information to people that they see to be valuable. And the one thing that's going to be interesting to watch going forward as things with COVID-19 start to change and we start to get into our normal or new normal, as it were, or new abnormal, as Wendy might put it, whether that traffic is going to stick around over the long term or not is hard to say, or whether some of it will stick around is really what is going to be the big open question for us.
Yeah, it makes sense. Now, Sean, we talked earlier, and I had mentioned that it was my assumption that the type of content from the Globe and Mail that people would be engaging with the most would be COVID-19 related. You actually had some really interesting insights about some of the ways that is evolving and changing. Could you share that with the group?
Sure. So I'd say for about the first 6 weeks, starting in early to mid-March, all of our daily top 10, 20 stories lists were COVID related. Now, there were different elements of COVID. So some of it was careers based or work life based. Some of it was political, obviously. Some of it was business related, but everything in some way had COVID in the headline, which means it was in some way directly related to the pandemic. What we are starting to see now in the past, say, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, is a bit of a shift. So obviously our most popular stories overall are still our COVID stories, but we're starting to see different types of stories working their way into our top stories list. So we're seeing more arts as people are starting to, get more interested in shows that they might want to watch or that are going to be coming on board on some of the streaming platforms. Some discussions around when things are going to restart with like cinemas or theaters. We're starting to see a bit more of an uptick in some of our sports reporting, like the Last Dance documentary that was all about Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls' late 90s years to a championship, where we're seeing some English soccer starting to, get back into training. We've seen some soccer starting up in Germany. The NFL hasn't announced that it's going to halt the start of the season in September. So they're starting to get some more interest around that. And of course, everyone wants to know, like, is there going to be sports without live audiences? So as those questions come up, people want to read more information about it. We're also seeing more on the business side of the equation. So not just COVID related, but now more recovery related. So, what can we expect to see when it comes to government policies around reopening the economy? And what does that mean for small businesses and large businesses? So we're starting to see a little bit more around mortgages. People are starting to rethink whether or not they want to get back in the housing market, for example. So a little bit more of like the normal storytelling activity. And then perhaps most importantly, and Wendy alluded to this, is we're seeing an uptick in people looking for headlines that have some good news of any sort within them. I think people are getting more optimistic in Canada around the trajectory of the pandemic. It's starting to feel like it's turning a bit of a corner in a lot of the provinces, if maybe not necessarily Ontario and Quebec fully yet. But we are starting to talk about rebooting sections of our lives and of the economy. And so I think as a result of that optimism, we're seeing people craving more stories that are going to make them feel a little bit better about life in general.
Great. That's a great answer. Thank you so much. So speaking of businesses, how are consumers relating to content that engages brands? And what type of content in that way is resonating?
Yeah, I think, the trick there is, brands are trying to strike the balance between the PR side of being a brand. In other words, how do we insert ourselves into the news cycle, and the marketing side of brands, which is how do we market in a way that is not going to look opportunistic and not put a negative spin on our brand. So Wendy talked about a few of these things, but I always remember the first time someone a few weeks ago shared the YouTube video that was getting around that took a look at how all COVID related advertising and marketing is the same. It starts with the soft music, it transitions into the haunting images of frontline workers, maybe people wearing masks or working at grocery stores under difficult conditions, and then talks about how these brands are helping out in their communities or within their sectors or their industries or with their employees. In other words, the ways that they are giving back. So less about buy our stuff, but hey, just want to remind you that we're still out here. And by the way, we're going to put a really positive spin on the brand that we're putting in front of you now. But I think what we're going to start seeing, and we're starting to see a little bit of it now, is people looking ahead. So much in the same way that people are looking ahead to, a more positive aspect to their lives, to the economy, to getting back out into the world in ways that we've been missing over the past several weeks. Brands need time to plan their messaging. It's generally like a 4 to 6 to 8 week cadence from the beginning of the ideation around a campaign or a PR campaign to actually getting it out in market. Sometimes that can be shorter if it's hot on the heels of a news development, but when it comes to just getting your own brand messaging out there, it can take some time to get your creative ready to go. So I think now is the time where brands are thinking, how do we start to get back in market under more normal circumstances than we've been experiencing? So I think you're going to start seeing more traditional, hey, let's start talking a little bit more about our products and our services, because we think people are going to want them again, they're going to need them again, and they're going to be ready to start talking about using these products in the ways either they were originally intended or new ways in which they can be used, which is why I think you're starting to see announcements, for example, like Shopify partnering with Facebook on e-commerce and Instagram on e-commerce and Pinterest on e-commerce. They are starting to get ready for a world in which more products and services are going to be available. And let's figure out how we can market those in effective ways, because we think people are going to be ready to start putting their money down above and beyond just the basic goods like groceries.
Great, thank you. So on that note, as we're moving to a scenario where we are reopening, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you think the topics or the focus for the news media is going to be as we continue to push forward towards a reopened economy, a reopened country, inevitably reopened to international borders? Like, what do you see?
Yeah, so it's going to be, I think, a twist on what we would normally see. For the Globe and Mail, for example, that's going to be politics of all stripes, and that's going to be business. And I think if you were to bolt on careers as part of that, even though that's somewhat of a business story, there's a bit of a work-life element to that. So on the politics side, we have an election coming up in the United States that's going to impact the world. Everybody is going to be watching it. They're already watching it. They're watching it happen in real time, as the pandemic sort of leads into it. And they're going to be watching it in real time starting in November and all the way into the transition that will eventually take place in the White House in January. That's going to be a huge story that's already, starting to ramp up for reasons that everyone is familiar with. On the business side, people have lost jobs or their jobs have been impacted. Maybe they've been, in a position where there have been a temporary layoff or where they've had, some decreases in their salary. They're going to be looking for ways to kind of get back to the way things were when it comes to the job market. So there's going to be a lot of interest, I think, in that type of storytelling. I think there's going to be a lot of food supply chain issues that have already started to emerge a little bit, but are going to start to get a little bit more serious in coming months. We've seen outbreaks at places like meat processing facilities. We have seen issues around farmers having access to the seasonal workers that help them get seeds in the ground and get their plants growing for the season. So as our food supply gets interrupted, that directly affects people's lives. We haven't seen that at the grocery stores yet, but we probably will in the coming months. And I see that as being a really big story in the next little while. I mentioned arts and sports. I think those are going to start ramping up and becoming even more of interest for people for all the reasons that I outlined, but in particular because I think we're going to start to see a little bit more action and activity around those areas, and people are going to be keen to sort of move back into them. And then ultimately, I think what we're going to see is a transition toward coverage around retail, right? Retail is the big story right now because bars and restaurants were impacted so heavily. And you think about people who live either in big cities or small towns, what's the most important thing to the lives of those small towns? The strips on which businesses operate, right? The main arteries where people hang out. If half or more of the businesses on those arteries have shut down, what does that mean for our communities and for our lives in all kinds of ways? And I think there's going to be a ton of storytelling around, the impact that COVID-19 has had on the framework of the communities in which we all live and work.
For sure. Thank you for that. A question for both of you. Wendy, your main thesis, now is potentially the most important time for brands to be earning trust among consumers, presents an amazing opportunity. But that also means that reporters must be inundated with requests for quotes, comments, and content. How should brands approach reporters or understand when their stories could be relevant?
I don't think reporters being inundated with pitches and requests is new. And it's not because of COVID. I think they always have been. And so I think the same things apply. I think we need to really focus on what it is you're trying to say. And more importantly, if you have something to say. I think it becomes really clear if you're just trying to force yourself into a story or if you do have value to add. I think people need to remember that when you're approaching a reporter, you're really speaking through them to the audience. So if what you're bringing forward to them is not going to be relevant to the audience, it's not going to be relevant to the reporter either. And I think that's something that hasn't changed and probably won't change. I think the other thing is to not to try to have all the answers. I think in many cases, people try to build all the stories into one thing. And I think you're better off reaching out to multiple people, very specific stories. People are really focused on their community. I think there's going to be an interest and a focus on how things impact the local news and kind of do you have a role there? So I think, like I said, reporters have always been saturated, but stay focused and know what it is you want to say and if you should say it. And that's usually a really good place to start.
Great, thank you. Sean, do you have anything to add?
So I'm the guy who's on the receiving end of the PR pitches. I've known Wendy for quite a few years and she knows what she's talking about. So I agree with everything that she has said. What I would add as the person on the other side of the ledger is that relationships are really important. Journalists are creatures of habit. They like to go to sources that they know and trust. So as a PR person, if you are able to build relationships with reporters so that when your name pops up within one of their feeds, whether it be, email or social media or whatever platform you're using to reach out to them, it is crucial that it is recognizable to them. And it becomes recognizable because you're providing them with value, which means, to Wendy's point, providing them with the right stories in the right time and when it's the right place to do so. Other things to remember, our attention spans are short, all of us, not just journalists. So you've got to, catch people's attention immediately, and that starts with the subject line. So, as a journalist, I think in terms of headlines are what people look at before they click through to a story. So think of the subject line as being akin to a headline. If you see that subject line, is that something you're going to click on, or is that something you're going to ignore? So make sure that the most important thing that you're trying to use to get attention from a reporter is in that subject line. And if you can't think of what that subject line should be, it's probably not worth sending anything to them in the first place, because you don't necessarily have a story to tell. Keep your email to like a few short sentences. The biggest mistake PR people make is sending me something that looks like a press release where I've got to read through like 3 paragraphs to maybe try to find the thing that might be in there that's of value. Just tell me what's the valuable issue here. And that's really all I need to know. The rest of it can be discussed if there's something of interest. And then lastly, I would point out that you want to be as relevant as possible. So it's not just about you or your client. So I don't need to see an email that says, hey, my client's been really successful in what they do, you should write a story about them. That's not a story. If that's the best you've got, think about what your client knows about what is going on in the news currently. So if they are an expert in something that's COVID related, or something that's business related, or something that's health related, then say, this is what's in the news right now. My client can add value to this story by telling you X, Y, and Z. And that's a way sometimes to get your client in a story that's not necessarily a gold medal, but maybe a silver medal or a bronze medal, in that they're mentioned in the story as an expert, but it's not all about them, their product or service. It's still valuable. It actually might even be more valuable sometimes than a story that revolves only around them.
That's great advice. Thank you. This will be the last of our premeditated questions, and then I see that we have an audience question, so we'll move on. Wendy, you gave some great examples of brands who have done some really compelling and interesting things to help their employees, their shoppers, their communities. But what about smaller businesses who don't necessarily have the same resources? How can they do things to earn trust at this time?
I think small businesses more than ever are in a really unique opportunity right now. Things have really leveled, the playing fields have really been leveled. And like we saw in the example with the small batch distillers, their uniqueness and their competitive advantage, rather, is their ability to be agile and to be creative and to respond to what's happening. So I think with small businesses, and it's not different for bigger brands, is again to kind of know what you're trying to say. And it isn't about promoting yourself. And I think that's the mistake that some people tend to fall back on, is that they think that in talking to the reporters and sharing their story, that it's really about them, but it's not. It's about the solution you're providing, or about something that you're changing, or the impact that you're having in Canadians or other businesses or an industry. It can't be about you. So it's not necessarily that that small businesses have a harder time to do this, is that sometimes they're just, because they're a small business and they're so focused in their own world, they forget to look at things from their customer's perspective. But start there, and you should, I think that's usually a good place to start.
Makes sense. Thank you. We have an audience question, and I'm going to read it, so forgive me. Hi, Sean. Has the Globe and Mail seen any particular spike in the popularity of columnists that could possibly be attributed to trust?
Great question. That's always the difficult balance when you're a media organization, is do readers understand the difference between a news story and an opinion piece? And the reason I mention that is because I mentioned fake news off the top. And I think a lot of the reason that that term got coined is not just because of the news stories, because that's obviously part of it, because people do sometimes think that they're biased, and maybe sometimes they are. But generally, I like to think, at least at the Globe and Mail, they are not. But opinion pieces get lumped in. People don't recognize necessarily when a piece is supposed to be opinion, in other words, one person's opinion, versus the opinion of the newspaper. And then sometimes editorials get thrown in there too that are, sort of supposed to speak for the organization. And people sometimes confuse the editorials as being a news story when they are not. They are opinions of the people who work at the news organizations as people, as opposed to being objective pieces of journalism, which is what news stories are supposed to be. So the answer to your question is yes, we have seen an increase in the popularity of our opinions. Is that because they're opinion pieces? I'm not sure. We've just seen so much traffic increase at the Globe and Mail, like that tripling of traffic. We're just seeing, more traffic to everything that we're producing. I would say that our news stories are getting the bulk of that increase. Opinion pieces are getting a piece of that increase as well. But I think that people are looking to experts as well for opinions. I mean, as humans, we naturally want to know what other humans think. And so I think when there are opinion pieces out there, if you agree with them, you think, this is great, I love this person's opinion. If you don't agree with them, you can get mad at them. And that gives you an excuse to either go out on social media and voice your own opinion, or it gives you an opportunity to get into the comment section of the opinion piece and have your say, or to just, kind of get you riled up and interested in what the person has to say. I do think that there is a very strong place within a news organization for opinions, because I think people want to see them, whether they like them or not.
Great, thank you. And now before we go, and I let you both off the hook, if there is one piece of advice that you would give any brand right now, or all brands right now, what would it be?
Oh.
What advice would I give them?
Yeah.
So I alluded to this a little bit, which is it's time to start thinking about getting back in market in slightly more traditional marketing ways. And I think that that is an opinion that is not necessarily shared across the board. I think a lot of brands right now, and their agencies and their PR businesses, and Wendy will naturally speak to this when it comes time, they are a bit paralyzed by what to do. And I get that. It's easier for me as a marketer to say, yeah, you should get back out there and start marketing your material in more traditional ways, because that's my instinct, right? Is get out there and start telling people about yourselves, because that's how you draw business, right? So the more you sit on the sidelines and have nothing to say, the more people might forget about you. Or I hate to say it in this day and age, but they might think you're out of business. So I do think it is important to be very neutral in the way that you're positioning yourself, as a brand. You don't want to just come straight out of the gate doing exactly what you were doing 4 months ago. You want to be mindful of the fact that there is still a pandemic out in the world and people are dying and people are getting sick. And that's, important to have in any plan that you have out there. But there is also nothing wrong with saying to people, listen, we have something, whether it's a product or a service, that we think you could use right now. And we just want to remind you that it's out there. Because I do think we need to start transitioning away from those standard COVID types of advertising, where it is the soft music and frontline workers and the impact on the community. I think we need to marry a little bit of that with a little bit more of the traditional as well, as people start to, I feel, be prepared to resume some of the elements of their lifestyles that they've been missing out on for the past 2 months.
Sounds great. Thank you.
I think the only thing I would add to that is to not only think about what your long-term plans are, but what your midterm plans are and your short-term plans are, so you can be ready. Because like I said earlier, I don't think any of this recovery is going to be like a straight line growth. I think we're continue to see ebbs and flows in the market and people's opinion and people's health. I mean, we're already talking about, when is the next, peak going to come? So I think we need to be ready for that. And so in that, it's more just, like kind of almost having like an if-then communication strategy. So if this, then how are we going to move forward? And if that, how are we going to move forward? So you're not scrambling when something does happen, but you're already just kind of ready to hit the ground running when everyone is not only talking about recovery, but ready to be marketed to, ready to have like that optimistic story. But if things flip like they have recently, to be able to react to that as well with a point of view and an opinion that is relevant and not tone deaf to the moment that we're in and the reality that we're in that week.
So this is the beauty of digital, in that you can pause or halt campaigns at any time. Because you make a good point, Wendy, like you do need to be mindful of the fact that you may need to turn on a dime. That's why I say to people, okay, start planning now, because you're going to want to be in market in like 4 to 6 weeks. In 4 to 6 weeks, we could see a huge increase in cases. We have no idea. If that's the case, it's not time to go in market with your traditional advertising campaign. It's time to go back to what we've been doing for the past 2 months. So absolutely, you need to be mindful of the fact that you are going to have to, be prepared to turn on a dime based on what is going on in the news. You don't want to just throw something out there that's tone deaf. But again, the beauty of digital is in its immediacy. Something can go out and market one day and you can pull it the next if you have to.
Thanks to both of you. That's great advice. I found this really insightful, and I'm sure everybody else did too. So I want to convey a huge thank you for today, Wendy for the presentation, Sean for joining, and all of the really like deep and insightful responses. And again, I'm so sorry I screwed up your name in the beginning.
Oh, it's okay. I have an uncle named Steven, so it's okay.
And
He'll be happy.
I thank you for being so gracious about that. So thank you both. For anyone whose questions we didn't get a chance to answer, or if you have questions preceding this talk today, please email them to myself, and I will make sure that you get a personal answer to your question. It's nglickman@experiencediamond.com if it's not on the screen. The webinar recording will also be live on our website, experiencediamond.com/aheadofthecurve. Tomorrow, should you like access to this talk again. The next webinar again is Wednesday, May 27th. That's next week from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we'll be hearing from Brooke to Catch on engaging from a distance, how the influencer industry has evolved amid COVID-19. That one's going to be really interesting, so please plan to attend. And stay tuned for more details coming to your email this week. Lastly, before I let you go, we'll be sending out an email shortly asking for your feedback on today's content. We value your feedback. Please, if you can, take the time to provide it because it allows us to continue to improve on this experience and make sure that future topics are relevant to you. And so there's a very short 2-question survey, and if you can, please fill it out. Our contact details are back up on the screen. Are they back up on the screen? Or will be back up on the screen. And if you'd like to reach out to connect or provide feedback, please, again, send a note to me directly. Thank you again, Wendy and Sean, for your presentation and the valuable information. And we wish everybody a lovely day and a lovely week. And since we won't speak to you, a lovely weekend. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.